Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 476th meeting since we started here in 2009. We put a speaker in every week, a different subject. Our speaker has to be for or against something, we don't care what it is. We give them an hour to make a presentation, up to an hour. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter that we listen to only one fool at a time, one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in this audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, close the meeting. But before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have an announcement they want to make? Now's the time to do it. You got an announcement?
Well, you should announce you're not going to be here.
Well, I won't be, John will be here.
Okay.
I'll be gone, we're going on October 3rd, we're going to Boston. And we're gonna get on a ship out of Boston on October 5th. Go to Halifax, we're going to
You guys want to
Bar Harbor, Maine, and then Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then, I forget what island it is, Prince Edward Island, and then down the St. Lawrence Seaway to Quebec and Montreal.
Oh, wow.
And then, so I guess it's a leaf tour, I get to see the leaves, you know, so anyway.
Leif Erikson tour?
Yeah. Anyway, so that ought to be fun. We're gonna we'll be in Montreal a few days. So my daughter and
You're going with your daughter and your great-grandson?
my great grandson, it'll be
It's
nice.
lovely, actually.
Huh?
I say it's lovely this time. It's
Yeah.
It really is.
It's supposed to be high of 50
It's
degrees.
supposed to be raining every day, but oh well.
What, up in Canada?
Yeah.
You have an umbrella.
I have an umbrella, oh well.
But they don't, well, they just have little spins.
I don't know,
And then
oh well.
it'll be nice.
It'll be nice.
It'll be nice.
It'll be like 40 degrees cooler than it is here. right?
Probably.
Oh, come on up here. Announcement time.
Announcement time,
Last week I returned from the honor flight for veterans, and I want to encourage anybody who is a veteran in any of the wars to apply for the honor flight.
I'm gonna write it down.
They took us to Washington, and we saw all of the military veterans at no expense. Everybody had a guardian who met our every need. If you needed a wheelchair, you had it.
It's called the odd, Tom could do this. What is it called?
Honor flight.
The honor flight.
Oh, honor. Honor.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
There were 2 World War II veterans on our flight, and the rest of them were Korean veterans, except for 2 Vietnam veterans. So they're beginning to take Vietnam veterans and those in between Korea and Vietnam. Also, and if you know any veterans, be sure and
Oh, yeah,
tell
I know a
them.
lot.
I'm sure you can find out about it on the computer.
It's a wonderful organization, what they do.
But if you can't, you can be your name and telephone number, and I'll give you information. I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me. Also, if you know any women veterans, I visited the Women's Memorial, and they want the names and a little synopsis about every woman who has ever served in the military in history. And I was pleased to find myself in the computer as a veteran, and also my 2 sisters. We were all veterans, and
Wow.
so if you know any women veterans, be sure and tell them they can either go on the honor flight if they want to, or if someone does not want to go on it, they still want them to be in the computer.
Can your wife go with you on the honor flight?
Can your wife go
Can your
with
wife go
you?
with you on the honor flight?
Do they have
Can my wife
spouses?
get spouses? Can your spouse go with you on the
I've seen
No,
that.
your spouse cannot go.
Oh, that's good.
If you have your own guardian, it could be your son
Yes.
or daughter, they could go. The reason the spouses can't go as a guardian is because they're too old. The limit for guardians is 70, and the reason they have an age limit is because it's a lot of hard work. The guardians are trained, you have to, even if you're a son or a daughter, you have to take the training of how to take care of somebody else. And it takes a lot of energy, and, you know, we're in a wheelchair and the guardians are pushing it.
Did you, what years did you serve, Mary?
I was in the Korean, during the Korean War.
Yeah, so it has to be veterans that were operational during any war.
That's right, anybody who was,
Yeah.
well, it doesn't have to be during a war, you know,
But if you're, like, if you're a career veteran,
that's right.
then you have to have so many years in, fully
Oh,
retired.
Tom can go.
If you were in, and there was no war going on, you were still serving.
Yeah, and
You're a
you had
veteran.
made that your career. You
No,
retired.
you're just a veteran. You don't have to be a career. You could-
Well, I don't know, they're not taking, are they taking people that just did 2 or 3 years?
No, nobody does do it.
No, when,
What did you say?
I'm saying, it applies like to people that have had some tenure in the service as far, even if there wasn't a war going on? Or can anyone like, that did a 3-year stint in the army? can
That's
they-
right, any veteran,
Any?
that's
Okay.
right, because they were there in case of war, so, you know, they did what they were supposed to do. I felt a little bad about it because I didn't fight in Korea, you know, where they've suffered and they were
okay.
shot at and they froze to death. And I would have to tell the veterans who would tell me that I was in personnel and I probably sent some of them to Korea. And they would say, oh, well, thanks a lot, you know.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
But they convinced me that, you know, we also served. We would have gone if we'd been ordered to. We did what we were told to do.
That's right.
And every fighting man needs 7 or 8 people behind him
Right.
in supply and all of that business.
Were there many females?
Okay, go
Well, on my
online.
flight-
Why don't you go online?
No, I was the only woman.
All right.
I was the only woman, so I got a lot of attention.
I have an anecdote that applies here. Okay, after you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service
Well,
and
thank you.
and thank you for Tom too. Or anybody else a veteran? You guys,
Veteran of competition.
This is a anecdote about the Korean War and a group called the Chosan Pyu. There was a battle of the Chosan Reservoir, and very, very few allies survived there. And they have meetings every year where the Chosan Pyu get together. This was the weirdest thing. The universe is a weird place. I got a wrong number phone call, and the guy started talking to me as if I was somebody. I finally figured out he was a part of the Oklahoma Chosan Pyu. He was trying to talk to somebody in Texas, and he had dialed the wrong number. Within the last month, I had been talking to Larry Elwell, who is a member of the Texas Chosan Pyu, over some video issue or something. And so I was able to dig up and give this man Larry Elwell's number after he dialed the wrong number. And if you consider how few the Chosan Pyu are, that's really, really weird.
Yeah.
Okay, announcements?
Yeah, okay.
All right.
Next meeting for Philosophers Forum will be October 8th and at Aboka's Restaurant in Richardson. And Justin Fisher is going to be talking about who should be allowed to vote.
Any other announcements? We all through with announcements? Okay, well, next week, automation is here, the time for universal basic income, and Andrew Yang is now. He'll be the, Hexel, Colorado will be, he's with the North Texas group that is with, for Andrew Yang. He'll be talking about that, so you can find out about. He believes that everybody should get $1,000 a month, I believe, and so on. Anyway, October 12th, what Democrats must do in 2020, that's Kelvin Bluett, he'll be our speaker here. He's got, it's on the itinerary, I won't read all this. And October 19th, attaining carbon-free and a dividend. That's Garrett Pinnell. He's going to talk about that. It ought to be interesting. It's on your itinerary. On October 26th, John Lee will be talking about, is China a friend or a foe? So that's a good subject. Anyway, she'll be talking about that. It's on your itinerary. But our speaker tonight is John Beesley. He's an English-born author, retired after a long time with Xerox. He educated at London's Imperial College and University of Dallas. He's going to talk about America, what went wrong. And he will discuss how the cry, "Make America Great Again," known as MAGA, found resonance in America's new Rust Belt when only 75,000 votes was the election for Donald Trump. Clearly, Trump hit a sore nerve among America's left-leaning working class voters, the ones that the Democrats thought they had in the bag. The deck had been stacked against them, and they would, and from the word go, John will go back to the very beginning of the Republic and chart the significant events that finally lead to the current disconnection, the current denouncement.
Here.
He argues that, well, I didn't turn the light on, that was my problem. It's much better now. I lost my, experts predict that 1 in 3 Americans will have their job automated away by the year 2030. He'll explain the math for how the freedom dividend will work, how to pay for it. Well, that's I got the wrong guy.
Okay, Tom,
Just a minute, the deck had been stacked against them, and the word go. John will go back to the very beginning of the Republic and chart the significant events that finally led to the current denouncement. He argues that by examining the past, a better guide to the future may be found. One must live in hopes. Perhaps the latter-day Churchill will arise. Well, without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to John Beesley.
Can you?
Maybe turn that,
Yeah.
turn it down there.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
There you go, I'll give you some light.
All right, Lewis is on the subject. Friends, Romans, and, sorry.
And countrymen.
Yes. Anyway, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm pleased to be back in the country again after my sojourn in the old country. It's still there, doing reasonably well. So anyway, so I've got a dose of jet lag and 2 beers, so I might not be totally comprehensible tonight. But anyway, so tonight's subject is America, what went wrong. Of course, I could have written the subject, England, what went wrong. Basically, the same sorts of things went wrong. So, but you wouldn't be totally interested in that unless I'm asked. And so we'll concentrate on America tonight. So in general, you can divide up what went wrong is it sort of psychological factors or system functions, systemic functions. Anyway, so, I won't really concentrate too much on the psychology of things. I'll just go into that a little bit. Now, I grew up in England after the war, and of course the problem really was that England, the situation had totally changed. It was obvious to most people that Britain was in decline. The problem was the politicians were born in the Victorian age, and of course they grew up when Britain had its empire, and of course ruled when 1 in 5 people were British subjects, and so they really couldn't comprehend, this total change. Now America really is in a similar position. I think the world has changed around America, But America really is not totally come to terms with it and is not prepared for it. And so I think really that's a psychology that's gone on. But I'll put that to one side now and talk about the systemic problems. Because in terms of socio-economic indicators, both the US and the UK are in bad shape. And this has shown itself up in the general dissatisfaction and foreboding that's exhibited in both countries. We've seen Brexit in the UK, and of course the election of Donald Trump and MAGA in the US. And so there's a feeling that things have gone wrong, and so Britain looks back to the glory days of the Second World War, and America looks back to the aftermath and the glory days and the high production that happened after the Second World War, and hoping to go back to such times. So now, the one impediment that the UK does not have is a written constitution. And also, currently the US is beset with political, economic, and religious notions and dogma that initially were born in England in the 17th and 18th century. And of course in England these same notions have long since disappeared and been discarded, whereas they're in full flood still in America. So in many ways the system that America has is really one that's totally antiquated, and America basically are living in the past somewhat. So let's talk about these, let's unpack these things. Let's talk about politics and the political system. So let's go back to 1776, of course, July 4th rather, America declared its independence, as we know. And of course there were several grievances that America had. But you must remember these people that were living, about 2 million people were living in America at the time, and they were British subjects, in fact. But of course over the years, they developed certain grievances. And the first one, as Ken would know all about last week, taxation, you see. And so Britain, after, in 1763, was in fact the end of the 7 Years' War, when Britain was fighting the French alliance, France and Spain and so on. And so that left England somewhat depleted in its navy and so on. And so then came the American Revolution. And so, of course, as we know, the French and the Spanish aided the colonists in fighting Britain, and I think they were certainly the decisive factor in that. But of course, the grievance on England's part about the colonists is that basically for years and years, the Americans had been evading every tax that had been imposed and any legislation that was imposed. But the main problem from a British point was that the British Army was in fact protecting the borders in America against the incursions of the French on the one hand and the Indians on the other hand. And at that time it was estimated to cost about £370,000 a year. And so the British felt, well, the colonists should foot the bill somewhat. And so they came up with a thing called the Stamp Act, which meant that every document, newspapers and legal documents, would be printed on special paper that had a stamp on, or would carry a duty, and that would offset some of the costs. In fact, the amount would offset was about $60,000, about 1/6 of the cost of maintaining the army. But of course, the people that were affected, the lawyers and the publishers, were up in arms about this because this was a new tax And Americans have never been fond of paying tax then and since. And so, so they found this new tax, unacceptable. Now, ironically, today, Trump has gone around Europe saying, hey, you guys in the NATO alliance in Europe, you're not paying your fair share, which they want to be about 2% of the GDP. Now, in fact, England does pay 2% of the GDP, but people like Germany have never paid that. And they're the main beneficiaries of the NATO alliance. But anyway, that's by the by. Now, the other grievance at the time that caused the revolution was commerce. So now, during the 7 Years' War, of course, Britain was fighting Spain and France. So, but the colonists were evading all the laws and trading with the enemy. In fact, New England was importing molasses from the enemy territory because they wanted to, distill spirits and so on using molasses. So the sugar tax was imposed to offset that somewhat or prevent it. The other grievance was the Navigation Act, which Britain wanted all the trade to be carried by British ships, of course, and so that was quite natural. But of course that interfered with the colonists' trade somewhat, so that was another grievance. But the other grievance you've heard a lot, no taxation without representation. Although really there was representation, because the Governor General really reported back to the Parliament. Anyway, but the final thing, and I think this is really the main nub of it, was sovereignty. The colonists really didn't want to be ruled from Westminster, and so in the end they said, well, we want to govern our own affairs, and that settled that. And so in the end, the Declaration of Independence was made. And so, of course, as I said, Britain's enemies, France and Spain, aided the revolutionaries and made the significant difference. And the peace treaty came about in 1783. We must note, though, that in terms of Britain's enemies, in 20 years after this, in the Battle of Trafalgar, the British fleet defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets. And 10 years after that, the French were defeated at Waterloo when the armies of Napoleon were defeated by the Iron Duke of Wellington. So sort of Britain was up and running by a later date. So let's go back to the Constitution. So this was written in 1787, and the first 7 articles of the Constitution define the structure of government. And so in many respects, this Constitution was really harks back to the construction of the British system after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when King James II, who was Catholic, fell foul of the peers of the realm, and they raised an army against this Catholic king and deposed him, and he fled to France. And so they needed a Protestant to be king, and so they went across to Holland. And so William of Orange and his wife Mary came over as joint monarchs. And so, but when they came, in fact, they were prescribed, their activities were prescribed by Parliament. In fact, the king could have a cabinet by appointment, but each appointee had to be examined and approved by Parliament. And so, so you see, William had executive authority, but his cabinet had to be approved by the Parliament, which had a legislative authority. And so this is exactly the system that you have in America today. Basically, you have a monarch, so the president that can have appoint his own cabinet, and so on. Well, of course, England still has a cabinet, but it's inside Parliament. In fact, when the Prime Minister is elected, of course, he must be elected. He must be a member of Parliament, he or she. And then they create a cabinet out of members of Parliament. So it has nothing to do with the monarch anymore. So everyone who's in the governing cabinet, in fact, has to be elected through Parliament. And so the Queen does, Queen Elizabeth now, has basically no authority to do anything. Actually, she's much more of a figurehead, and really is quite above politics. And so really, so what America's done is had, as they say, is had an elected monarch, really. It also has the flavor of, it has hereditary features, because we've had the Bush dynasty, and we almost had the Clinton dynasty. So America is not quite a total republic. Okay. So anyway, as I say, the British monarchy has no executive authority, and so basically England has moved on, you see. Whereas in America, who copied this 300-year-old system, is stuck now in this system. And it has several very bad features, actually. And so the feature really was set in place that there's an election of Congress every 2 years. So the members of the House have basically a 2-year term, and are totally replaced, or can be replaced every 2 years. The Senate, on the other hand, each senator has a 6-year term, but 1/3 are voted every 2 years. And so what you can see going on is this electioneering is the continuing process. Whereas in England now, you have by statute election every 5 years, and the election cycle only lasts about 5 weeks. And so the cost of running in England, the same level of government compared to America, obviously is much compressed, is an ongoing electioneering process, and by that tune costs much less. In fact, it costs 10% of what they spend in America. Japan managed to spend only 1%. But the mere fact of this system really, as you might suspect, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Or as Tom often says, because of so much money is needed, it's the best democracy money can buy. But it's really the nature of the system that does this, because it's not a parliamentary system. It's got this rather peculiar ancient system. And so, of course, most legislation, in fact, favors the paymasters. Why wouldn't it? Because that's what you'd expect. And so basically, the interests of the ordinary working people are basically totally ignored. I mean, the lip service is paid to them, but it's the people who pay the freight here that write the legislation, and it favors now the major corporations, wealthy donors, and Wall Street. And really, they made a hell of a hash of it. And so really, I think people feel left behind and left out. They really feel that they're not being listened to. And this is part of the reason for the current discontent. I have a gap in my pages. And so the creation of the Supreme Court was another constitutional innovation, which is now very favorable to the corporate interests. And this was not always so, because actually corporations are still chartered, were and still are chartered by states. And in the middle of the 19th century, when they were being chartered, the states were very wary of their power, of their financial power, and they heavily restricted them. For example, they were forbidden to make political contributions. They could not hold interests in other corporations or companies. They weren't allowed to influence any lawmaking. And they were unable to shield managers from any illegal activity. Well, of course, all that is gone away now. Because actually the state as an influence on corporations has lost out to federal lawmaking, especially the Supreme Court. And of course, most of these protective measures that the states put in power are gone now. And of course, the most idiotic thing of all was in 1886, by a Supreme Court decision, they granted the corporations the rights and protections of personhood. And so today, the rights of corporate property now supersede community and employee rights. And so really, that's a denial of the rights of the individual, and I think is another reason why people feel so disenfranchised. And so American corporations, of course, have gone global and have had an amazing influence in the WTO rules. That's the World Trading Organization rules. And they're able to challenge entire countries if any legislation in foreign countries influences or degrades their profits. And America actually suffers the same thing in reverse. And so state laws can be overturned. And a corporation, for example, operating in Texas, under Texas laws, can be challenged by a foreign country if that foreign country feels that it's losing out by Texas legislation. And this is especially true in the financial world. Read my book on that subject, by the way. And so what we've seen is, of course, in corporations now make tremendous profits overseas, and of course these profits are now hidden away in tax havens, and of course the money they make is never to be seen in the U.S. where it's really needed, and that does hamper investment. And so the almost unlimited financial power now of corporate spending is unleashed by the 2009 Citizens United Act. And so, this is another nail in what I call democracy, because corporations are gaining more and more power and influence. And their influence is not benign by a long shot. And so the other thing that's gone on is that the Supreme Court has been totally politicized. I mean, you would think that the law, is the same for everybody, and therefore, but no, the Supreme Court, tries to analyze what the founding fathers were thinking about, when they weren't drunk, of course, about how things should be run. But of course, we've seen, especially of late, you have a 5-4 decisions come down, and so that calls into question. Well, look, how could this be? Surely the law should be the same appear the same to everyone. And so basically, I know I've joked, of course, many times, even here, there must be two constitutions, one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans, because that's the way it falls out. And so what we've seen, though, with the actions of corporations, of course, we've seen this disastrous offshoring of jobs and even technical knowledge. And of course, this went totally unchallenged by both political parties. There was a pushback by independents, such as Ross Perot in the 1980s, but again, that didn't go anywhere. And so basically, I have to say America has been sabotaged by this from within. And it's not external enemies that have done this. You know, Trump rails against China as you know, and these terrible foreigners are taking. No. Certainly the foreigners had nothing to do with this. These sorts of problems were homegrown and came because of the courts giving corporations unlimited power. And basically what's happened is that people don't count. And that's why I think they feel so disgruntled. And so, of course, the Constitution's first 10 amendments were largely taken from the Bill of Rights that were created after this glorious revolution of 1688. And that's when Parliament decided that, well, King James had been a terrible man. And so we're going to write down the rights of the individual, you see, against the power of the monarch. We won't let that happen again. And so, strange to say, one of the laws was the right of citizens to bear arms, actually, to protect themselves, the Protestants, against the Catholics. Now, today, that is still there. You can go and buy a gun in England, but you must have a license. You can't just walk in and buy a machine gun or anything like that. You have to have a license to do so. Now, of course, so this law was carried over to the American Constitution because, of course, when you don't have the British Army to protect you much anymore, you need a citizen army, and therefore the citizens, you know, were allowed to bear arms. And that's what it says, to form a well-regulated militia. Well, there is no need for such things because we have a professional army. And so, but that law that came from England 300 years ago means that we now have gun madness on the streets in America. You don't have gun madness in England. Well, that's where the law came from. And of course, in 9 out of 10 days in America, 9 out of every 10 days, there's mass shootings. That's to say, that mass shooting is when 3 or more people are injured or killed by guns.
2. The definition is 2.
Well, I had 3, but never mind.
Okay, don't interrupt us, speaker.
Because this is definition given by sources. Maybe 2 as well.
Let's not quibble about one dead body.
That would be even worse, actually. And so you should see that's where this gun madness came from. So let's talk about religion now. And so this is a popular topic. But anyway, religion, of course, as we know, has a special place in America and its social relations. One that closely accords with American individualism and self-reliance. And the Pew Research has found that in general, the more religious tend to be more conservative, to have more conservative views. The Protestants are more conservative than the Catholics. The Mormons and the Evangelicals are far more conservative than even the normal Protestant factions. And so the Evangelicals, of course, believe in so-called prosperity doctrine, where God has found the rich to be more worthy and therefore deserving and have granted them wealth, whereas the poor are more sinful and unworthy and therefore were not so favored. And that's why you have the poor in society. And so the New Testament is often quoted that if anyone is not willing to work shall not eat. That was written by the Apostle Paul, well after, of course, the death of Jesus, which really flies in the face of what Jesus did. He had a notion of the common good in the feeding of the 5,000, of course. And so the response to these ultra-compassionate evangelicals is, of course, one cannot find work at non-existent jobs. And there are many reasons why there are non-existent jobs. Because the level of the non-existent jobs is a feature of this system. It will always be there because that's the way the system works. Now let me elucidate this. The first person to point this out was Karl Marx. Every economist who should read Marx, he had some pertinent points to make, but his main one was that the capitalist system always gives the appearance of a surplus population. The main reason, he said, is because the capitalist system depends upon competition. And so when you have competition, you always have more efficient machines displacing obsolete machines. And therefore, when you have more efficient machines, these require fewer workers. And so workers are continually being displaced by these more efficient machines. And that was his main point, one of his main points in Das Kapital. And so what we see today is, in fact, we have an increasing number of oligopolies, which are concentrations of industrial power. And of course, with that, you have the economy of scale and increasing automation. And so this process of automating the workplace is continuously throwing off workers. But it's not only industrial workers that are being displaced, but we see white-collar jobs being displaced. So you see that what Marx said, over 150 years ago is still true today. The second point is the fact that a private bank's charter is to control inflation. Now, the private bank, of course, is the Federal Reserve. It is not federal, and it's not a reserve, which is why we call it the Federal Reserve, of course. And so, what happens is that when the unemployment rate gets down to around, say, 4%, then there is a fear of inflation, because there'll be the working people will find themselves in a more powerful position, because there'll be this army of reserve, the great army of reserve unemployed will be diminished, and therefore the wage base will be bid up. And so, of course, what happens then is to stop that, the Reserve increases the interest rates, which slows down the economy and maintains this reserve army of unemployed. And as we know, the figures quoted right now is around about 4% or less, but we know that it's double that. And so we really have this reserve army of 10 to 12 million people maintained by the system. It will always be that way. This is the way the system works. Either unemployed or underemployed. And certainly in England, you have so-called zero-hour contracts, whereby you work, but there are no guarantee of any hours in any one week. I mean, it's absurd, but that charlatan Tony Blair introduced it, the Labour Party, of course. Anyway, so the other thing that's gone on is, of course, the offshoring of manufacturing jobs. 20 million jobs have been offshored in the last 30-odd years. And therefore we have this Rust Belt, Ohio and Michigan and so on. And of course, Trump made a big point of this, and he had a point. Because, well, heretofore the Republicans and the Democrats shrugged this off as if, oh, well, it's just a system. Globalization, is so wonderful. That's the lie that Clinton talked about. Anyway, as I say, Trump was right, and he hit a nerve, and here we are. So the other thing we've had is 45 years of stagnant wages. And of course, people have made up for that by having second jobs, but in certain professions, like certain nursing professions, you aren't allowed to have second jobs. Now, I was at a party where, at the famous range here, where Rick was talking, was it Rick? Yeah, was talking about the fact that this is terrible, the workers are in terrible debt, and this is good. Well, no wonder they're in terrible debt, because their wages have not caught up with the increase in costs. So the only way out is to start borrowing. So, and of course, the other thing that's gone on is we have no industrial policy. We have no proper business creation program. And we have no comprehensive retraining program that really retrains the workforce for new jobs as they appear. And certainly the poorest don't have the time or money, because if you're going to retrain, the corporations won't pay, the government won't pay. There was a retraining program in the 80s, but St. Ronald Reagan put paid to that. So let's build more statues to it. So you see, this continues to exacerbate the angst that's felt by the precariat. And the precariat is defined as people who are living on the edge with housing, food, and so on. And of course, the other thing that the sainted Trump has done, not the saint, has cut the welfare program, cut the food stamps program by a third. And so currently there are 13 million children living in food and shelter insecurity. And the worst city of all is Washington, D.C., where there are 400,000 families in such situation. So, the other thing that's gone on, you see we're still talking about religion, is the evangelicals, of course, being the most right-wing of all, continue to have an outsized influence on politics. And of course, Mike Pence, Vice President, is an evangelical par excellence. And of course, the attitude is that the undeserving poor don't deserve to be taken care of, even as we know that this army of unemployed is permanent and maintained by the system, as I've just described. And so these undeserving poor will continue to suffer the consequences. Their children will go to bed hungry, and we see other examples of what goes on in this totally compassionless society. For example, in Denver we see a woman in jail giving birth to a child alone with no medical care. In Alabama, we see a black man jailed for 36 years for a $50 robbery. So there is not much forgiving our trespasses in the USA, which as a country is deeply religious but profoundly unchristian. Let me repeat that. The country as a whole is deeply religious, but in its culture is profoundly unchristian. So that's what I'll say about religion. Now let's get back to economics. So of course, when the Industrial Revolution took place. It took place at the beginning of the 18th century, and it displaced the prior system, which was the mercantile system, controlled by the merchants and so on. And so this required a completely new set of economics. And this set of economics was compiled by Adam Smith. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, just about the time of the American Revolution. And of course this extolled the virtues of the free market, free trade, and laissez-faire. Now, one of the principal effects of this revolution in industrialization is the fact that corporations are needed to gather together the amount of money needed to fund such large organizations. Now, the crucial difference is that the investors were not really investors in the normal sense. See, an investor is someone who invests for the long term. If, on the other hand, you invest for the short term, you're a speculator. And so when you're a speculator, you want to get your money in and get it out. And so the stock market affords that facility. It's called liquidity of your investment. And so this facility of getting your money in and out, where the stockbrokers say, the stock market is going up, buy, 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 buy. And a week later they're saying, oh, well, there's a turn, sell, sell, sell. And so actually this phenomenon, demand for liquidity, destabilizes the stock market. And of course, the great destabilization happened in the 1920s, when the stock market was going up and up and up. And of course, the other thing that helps the stock market going up and up and up is being able to buy on margin, which is great when it's going up. But once it hits, and of course people are saying, well, why work anymore? You can just invest in the stock market and grow rich, by doing nothing. Well, that was a foolish notion to begin with. But anyway, when the market turned, and of course all markets turn, then of course these margins are called in, and of course people can't pay, and so there's a run on the bank, and the whole system collapses. Now, as Keynes pointed out, that this collapse can happen, and the balance level can occur at a very high level of unemployment. And in his book he pointed out the only escape then is fiscal spending. Now, if you believe in Adam Smith, you say, oh, no, that's against the rules, you can't do that. What must happen, because as the economy crashes, well, then the prices go down. And therefore, if only wages would go down, then everything would commensurately, then everything would stabilize out. Well, of course, that doesn't happen. Fight back, because in fact, you have vast number of unemployed, and so in the 30s, as we know, there was 10 years of depression. And the only thing that saved it was huge fiscal spending by the advent of the Second World War. And within 6 months, everyone was back to work. And of course, it led to a huge development in America, in the technology and business. And so, now, the other thing that happened was during the 1930s, 1933, FDR introduced safeguards to prevent this thing happening again. And the big safeguard, there were all sorts of safeguards in the financial system that he put in place, but the big safeguard was the so-called uptick rule. That's to say, you couldn't short the market when it was going down. You could only short the market when it was going up. And so a gentleman called Christopher Cox became president of the SEC in 2007, put in there by W, just in time for a massive short of the market, because they repealed the uptick rule. And so by shorting the market, you can drive it down, and the market, as you may remember, was driven down by 50%. And so since the 80s, we've seen, so gradually, with the power of Wall Street and the oligopoly of the major industrial institutions, you've seen every safeguard that was put in place repealed, one after the other. And what we have seen is that this increasing number of financial downturns. And they became worse and worse and worse until we came to 2008, when we had the Great Recession. That was really caused by this same phenomenon, a total financial irresponsibility and greed into the bargain. And so what we have now, with the financial corporate elite, we don't really have a proper functioning financial system. Because what a financial system does, it invests in the country, in the community. Okay, that's its job. But no, it doesn't do that. It wants to collect your money and your deposits. And basically, it's just a giant gambling machine on every commodity. The biggest one, of course, is the Forex market, where every day about 4 to 5 trillion are traded every day. And of course, that's a total waste of time and effort. It's totally unproductive. And so America is starved of financial capital that should be going into small business startups, should be going into education, should be going into infrastructure, and so on, and housing, and all the things that people really want. But we'll never get. And so basically what you have is the financial system, you're basically having the tail dragging the dog here. And that's especially true in England. So I mean, it's just not America, it's across the world. You know, and as we speak, we're now talking ourselves into recession. You know, if you talk about it long enough, it's going to happen. And really, it's these financial spivs that cause it. You can ask me what spiv is later, but and so then you have trade. Well, of course, Donald Trump has made a great issue of the massive imbalance of trade between the US and the rest of the world, most significantly with China. And of course, this would not now be a problem if the US had listened to Lord Keynes in Bretton Woods in 1944. Because he proposed the Bank-Orbig and international currency, and this would have ensured and mandated balanced trade. But America thought it didn't like that. It didn't want that sort of a thing. And so it didn't have it, and it's paid the consequence. So the conclusion one has, really, when you look at the whole thing, is basically the American elite have captured the institutions of state to exclusively enrich themselves, while making the lives of the working class increasingly more precarious. So no wonder they're upset. No wonder they vote for Trump. No wonder they vote for Brexit. And you can can see why. And so, since the 1970s, wages have largely stagnated. And since the Great Recession, they've actually gone down in buying terms. But of course, the cost of housing, education, and healthcare have skyrocketed. So the very poorest are trapped in impoverishment, unloved and uncared for. So an easily affordable welfare state could exist, but now the money is spent on the military-industrial complex. It's squandered on non-productive assets, as we see housing. See, money goes into housing, but it's still the same house. The fact that it used to be $50,000 and now is $300,000, so what? It's still the same house. So that's not done anything. But so what you see is asset speculation that's gone on. And of course, what's happened is, to pay for this imbalanced trade, of course, the US, and similarly the UK, has had to sell assets. Its assets. And so really what I would think that there needs to be a refocus on the needs and wants of the ordinary American people, instead of the desires of the rich elite to further enrich themselves. I mean, they have enough money anyway, but they want more. But in the process, they are in fact wrecking the country. And so I say, unless we do this, then the health, the socio-economic health of the country won't be restored. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Let's go. Well, John, I am amazed that you were able to do that on only 2 beers. Anyway, that was a very good talk. I appreciate that. Can you fill in a little more on Keynes and the Bancor? You touched on that, but give us a little more detail, please.
All right. Okay, he basically, when Britain had the reserve currency in the old days, like 200 years ago, all international debts were settled in gold. And of course, if you had a trade imbalance continually, you'd run out of gold. And so what would happen would be that your currency, which is based on gold, would diminish in value. And so Keynes said, look, let us recreate the same thing. Let's recreate the same thing, but with a paper currency, which he called the Bancor, which bank meaning bank or being gold. So it was really a replacement of gold. Now, how this would work is as follows. So there's an international currency. So all international debts would be settled in the Bancor. If you have a surplus, then so every say 9 months, 12 months, or a year, there'll be a realignment. So if you had a surplus, then your money, your national currency, with respect to the Bancor, would go up in value. So your goods would be more expensive. If you had a deficit with respect to the Bancor, your currency would diminish. So your goods would be cheaper. And so by this mechanism, you see, it would ensure that trade is always balanced, because your goods would get more expensive, and on the other side, the goods would get cheaper. So in America's case, vis-a-vis China, what would happen is the dollar would decrease in value with respect to the Bancor, so American goods would be cheaper, so we could export more. Chinese goods, because the yen would go up in value, so their goods would be more expensive. So by this, the other thing, the benefit too, is that currencies would stabilize. Okay, so every day, if you look at the forex market, which, as I mentioned, is like 4 trillion a day situation. I don't know how you can trade with the swing, rapid swings that happen. But this situation, currencies vis-a-vis would be stable until they realign. And so by this mechanism, you would ensure you had balanced trade. And so America, if they'd listened to Keynes, would not have gone into this globalization system and shipped all of its goods and industry overseas. I mean, it just couldn't happen.
So are you saying Keynes would have been against NAFTA-GATT?
Yeah, the way it worked out, yeah. Because you see, well, the system as Harry Dexter White proposed, he was working for Morgan for, was, okay, every currency is fixed against the gold, with the dollar at $35 an ounce, you see. So everything was fixed. But the problem is, of course, when America had a huge trade deficit that started in the late 50s, by the way, that began to, to shatter that system. But there was no, and in fact, in the late 60s, America was in such a policy condition, it had to borrow, basically paper money to pay for its deficit. And of course, 73, the whole thing collapsed. And so now it's free for all. And if you look at the swings, look, recently I've been trying to spend money in England, spend money in Finland, and boy, it's so difficult. I mean, anyway, but I don't understand how you can do national trade because the swings are enormous. I mean, you got plus or minus 15, 20%. Now if your margin is 5%, a trade, for example, you're going to be wiped out every month or so. It's just, to me, it's ludicrous. So anyway, so that's what Keynes proposed, and that's what rejected. Now the other system that I think England is going to probably have to adopt is the one that was introduced by Hitler's Chancellor, Helmar Schacht, which was a system whereby you could only sell, say you take China, you say to China, we're going to buy from you, but you must buy the same amount from us. And so money never crosses the border. It's sort of like a barter system. And that was very successful for Germany, in fact. If you look at how Germany recovered in the 30s, it's quite remarkable, but that was due to Helmar Schacht. Anyway.
You made the statement that this country is profoundly un-Christian. I think the evidence shows that no country gives more to charity than America. And whenever there's a disaster in the world, American entities are there almost immediately taking care of people. If this country is profoundly un-Christian, why is that happening? And why are not other countries doing what we're doing in helping people out of disasters?
Well, what I would say is that the un-Christian or the uncaring nature of the country has to do with how we care about each other at the national level, not the international level. Actually, the international aid is really quite small, and it's pittance really compared to the GDP of America. And so we don't have a proper healthcare system, all right? People can be bankrupted if they fall ill. We don't have a proper economic stabilization system, that when people do get unemployed, as they will through automation, you don't have a proper unemployment and retraining system, and you don't have a proper education system. I mean, look, I went to Finland, a country of 5 million people. education at university level is free in Finland. Now, little Finland, 5 million people, can afford to educate its people. America can't. The corporations, of course, require, I mean, if you go for employment, for example, you'll see a 20-year-old asking you, oh, well, this, you must be expert in language X. You must have 2 years experience in language Y. You must have another year's experience in language Z. And you say, well, that's pretty difficult, madam, because that brand only came out 2 months ago. So anyway.
So you're saying that because we don't follow Democrat policies on the national level, we're unchristian?
These aren't Democrat policies because both parties have behaved the same.
Well, you're saying national health care, which is a Democrat policy. You're talking about national education, which is a Democrat policy. And you're talking about other policies that the Democrats push, and you're saying that because we don't do that, we're unchristian.
Well, yes, because what did Christ say? It said first.
Was Christ a Democrat?
No, he was a Christian.
Probably, if you
Yeah.
think about it.
Jewish, and 74% of all Jews are Democrats. So
Yeah,
it's
no.
very,
No.
it's very
Look.
likely that he was.
Look, this is look.
Democratic Party didn't exist yet.
Well, you know that.
If you, as I said, if you want to maintain a reserve army of 10 to 12 million people, always, and you start cutting the benefits. As by the way, we've seen the Tory right-wing party in England, okay? Because they wanted to shrink the state. And I have much more to say about them for the same reasons, okay? But they don't go around parading themselves as Christians, actually. All right? Whereas people like Pence, the evangelicals, do. And my reaction to Pence and Ted Cruz, yes, you're religious, but you're not obeying the dictates and the Christian notions that Jesus Christ had of helping the poor. That was the main.
Because they're not doing it the way the Democrats would.
It's got nothing to do with the Democrats.
I think it has everything to do with the
No,
Democrats.
it doesn't. It's fallacious. Both parties, to me, are about the same. All right? Both parties are dependent on big money, and big money in this country doesn't give a damn about the ordinary American.
I don't think it's true.
They don't. They've shipped the jobs overseas.
And Trump's bringing them back.
No, let him answer.
Okay, let him.
You know.
Let's just-
Yeah, you can ask me more questions. Well, let me
Okay,
Well,
finish.
well, that's
let
okay.
Lorraine
Look,
talk.
I went through rationale. Why this huge reserve army of unemployed always exists in this system. And I've said people like Pence and Trump have cut benefits. And the main rationale is these people are sinful and unworthy.
I haven't
Yes.
heard them say that.
Well, okay.
I haven't heard that as a rationale.
But what is the rationale? You can get up and tell us why the rationale for cutting food stamps.
Okay, let's just.
And the rationale, look, Lorraine, you can speak.
Yeah.
No, the rationale, generally speaking, is these people are work shy. All right? Now, when the
Yeah.
Tory party, let me continue. In England, it's the same. The right-wing party, when David Cameron, who was supposed to be touted as this compassionate guy, came in, the first thing they did was to cut taxes for the top tier people. Second thing they did was to privatize the benefits system. Okay? And what happened then? These people, oh well, if you're unemployed, you can't get any benefits for 8 weeks. 8 weeks, God, people were losing their homes in 8 weeks. So look, the general notion is unchristian in my judgment. And that's my judgment. Now you may say, oh no, it's totally Christian to cut benefits to the poor, to cut benefits to, the poorest. No, look, as I read the scripture, and by the way, in my school in England, everyone had to have religious instruction. All right? So, I mean, we read the Bible. I read it. Many people here call themselves Christians. They've never read the Bible. Okay? There were very strange notions about what the Bible says. They pick out these bits and pieces that they hear, but it's got nothing to do with helping the poor. Now, look, my view is that it's not only Christian, but helping the poorest, and it makes economic sense. We want every person in this country to have a good education. Now, so basically, the richest, of course, like W, can go off to Yale and whatnot. They waste their time there. But the very poorest, actually, are usually the ones with motivation, actually, and they're the ones that we need. And so, yes, I maintain that this country, in the way it operates and its cultural values, is un-Christian. And I think the results and so on bears it out. And I think, yes, I am a product of the welfare state, all right?
Okay.
So, look, after the war, unlike Americans, I mean, Britain was bombed. I lived in a city that was bombed. There was no housing at one point to go back to. Now, the Labour Party came in, and it said, and the people voted them in. And Churchill was kicked out because he was a right-wing Tory. And people said, never again, we're not going back to the hungry 30s, when there was 10 men for every job. And so there was free education through university level. There was a national health service created, and there was public housing created. So the pillars of what you needed were created. And so I'm not going to now, having benefited from that, turn around and say, well, now, of course, the right wing now, in fact, has destroyed all that. Education is no longer free in England. Public housing has been cut to shreds. There is no more. And the National Health Service has been half privatized because Thatcherism said, under the dictates of her Adam Smith policy, everything should be privatized. And the consequence in England was, it's now all in foreign hands. The car industry is now in foreign hands. London Airport is owned by the Spanish. The water company is owned by the Germans. Buses in London are owned by the Germans. And half of the real estate is owned by the Chinese. I mean, her policy of, she had a war. She hated the working people, and they hated her. She shut down business in the north of England and the Midlands, never recovered. But her feeling was, you privatize everything, and the private system will certainly flourish, and all these things will pop up. Well, it did. It did. And of course, the notion that this neoconservative policy will ever work is totally fallacious. And you've seen it here. These jobs, do you think it's Christian to ship jobs overseas along with the technology? Do you think with any person in a corporate position that would do that? Just lay off people and say, okay, and by the way, I will pay you a little bonus. You can train the Koreans in your job. Now, could you bring yourself to do that? I certainly couldn't. And look what it's done to the country. It's wrecked it. It's wrecked it. And by the way, we're going to cut retraining, which is what Reagan did. Do you think that's Christian? No. Now, and when you're ill, and you go to hospital, 40, 50,000, how could, and the company you work for you're not paying that anymore, and your wife and your kids are ill, but tough luck. Do you think that's Christian? No. I don't think so, Ken. I don't. I don't think any Christian person that is a Christian would do that. Because Christianity, as its essence, cares for the whole community. I mean, that's what the message is. It's helping the poor and taking care of people. And by the way, when you do, when, you know, the attitude of many of these elite, and I went to school with them, they think all the poor people are stupid, okay? They have no brains. Well, my reaction is, these people do, in fact. But they're never listened to. Because only the corporate elite, you know, can know anything or make decisions. Well, I've seen disasters in corporations over that attitude. And if you ever get up and remonstrate with them, you have to be fired. And of course, where I came from, you know, I would do that. You know? So, no, that's what's wrong with this country. Okay? Now you may think, well, what's gone wrong is there's too much socialism. Well, I don't see any socialism here much. I see a lack of care for people. And they don't care about people. They're just numbers to vote. They don't write the legislation. They don't. Okay, Rain, now you're...
No, I got another opening, another show. Beyond, you know, the cloak of righteousness that Christians seem to wrap
they're not
themselves.
Christians, though. That's
No, the Christians prefer to wrap themselves in because they consider themselves right, John.
The Rain...
I know they are.
Rain, never call them Christians.
No, well,
just call them religious people.
religious people, though,
Please.
of a certain denomination.
No, just call them...
Okay, so...
I mean, you know...
Beyond all of that, because I concur with you,
As a
I agree with you.
Christian,
You
My
can put-
question is,
All right,
as
go,
it relates to charity,
Yes.
okay. First off, we are not the #1 giver of charity. In fact, from a UN perspective, I think, is it Denmark that gives far more per capita?
Percentage-wise.
Yeah, percentage-wise. They give more than we do. We're low on the list. And even as it relates to charitable giving by countries, we're 4th on the list.
and
Indonesia,
Australia.
Australia, which actually quite confused me because I thought they'd rather spend their money on beer. And New Zealand.
Is that
But
right,
Indonesia, yeah.
Alan is going to speak.
The ciggies and the fags, you know, which in Australia, that means, the beer and the fags, which is ciggies. It's a
Right.
it's a slang term. But US is also 4th as it relates to that. But that's not the point I'm making. The fact is that one even tries to pocket, you know, religion as it relates to charitable giving is to infer that no one else who isn't Christian doesn't have any charity. And would you agree that there's probably a lot more non-Christians giving to charities in the world?
Can I answer that?
Of course.
The studies have shown that the amount of charity, of course, is large, but it's nowhere near large enough to cover the social needs.
I'm not even
And
talking
so,
about countries.
you know, the deal is really the state is the only entity that can cover the needs, you know, of education, of infrastructure, and so on, you know. But you see, you know, look, it has to do with culture. Now, when I was in England, I really felt that the state was my fallback because I had all these benefits. So people didn't worry about getting ill. Okay, you know, in my case, I went to the best college that you could go to. You know, money wasn't a concern. And so that to me is Christianity, where you care about the community. You don't go back to this individual and ruggedness, which America, espouses, okay? It's ludicrous. The notion is ludicrous. It's promoted by people who have the money, who are complacent, who don't want the brightest of the poor competing with their dimwit, offspring. Because most of these, like Trump, basically a dimwit, okay? Who's squandered billions of money, has it, but you see, the point is, the reason for what I'd say state, if you want to call it welfare or Christianity in terms of that concept, is that we need to help our people the best we can, give them the best start in order to compete in the world. And when you don't, you have what we have now. We have an increasing number of the precariat.
Yes.
We have desperate levels of poverty that people of Europe just couldn't imagine, actually.
I know.
And it's the callousness that goes with it.
They don't care.
They don't care.
They don't care.
And
That
of course-
which is, to me, is not a
And of course,
Christian value.
going back to David Cameron, okay, in England, the Tory party, all they were talking about, the reason why they were cutting the benefit, is because these people were scroungers off the state. They didn't want to work, and therefore you should cut the benefits to encourage them to work. Well, I've gone through the reasons why there will always be this high level of unemployment. Now, because in England they followed Keynesian policies in the 50s, the level of unemployment was about 1%. So you can do that with state policies,
Yes.
but not in this country.
No.
You're happy to see this vast number of people who are unemployed, underpaid, and so on, and desperate. And they're happy to see that. They believe that's, and by the way, it's their fault.
Yeah.
Into the bargain.
Other than the bones they throw to the religious right, politically.
Religious right, you've got the name
Yeah.
right.
Why do you think all of these people have such myopic memories as to when this really revved up beginning in the 80s all the way through? You and I were in a corporation, we saw it happen before our eyes, okay? And that corporation is no longer the Fortune 100 that it used to be because it's been splintered into nothingness. I just don't, what do you attribute to this narrow-minded view that people have that somehow business is going to make their lives so much better when they've seen what business has done since 1980?
Well, I think the main driver was the so-called Powell memorandum, which set in train all these right-wing think tanks, which began to promote the idea of laissez-faire and all the rest of it. And also, because actually they were worried really basically about democracy. They didn't want such things as employee ownership. They didn't want such things as the poor people taking control of the situation and so on, because it would take away their privilege. I mean, that's the fundamental problem. These people in power, I mean, you've heard recently about the rich and powerful actually buying their kids into college, okay? Because they can. Now they're probably taking it away from some poor kid who would be, who needs to be there.
I just wanted to ask something, John. On the slate for the presidential election, on the Democratic side, there's a man called Yang. What do you think of his policies as regards money because he believes that everybody should have a very basic salary
Yeah.
so that they can live, at least eat and have somewhere to live. And I was wondering what.
But obviously, when you have the problem, the inverse of that is when you impoverish people so much that they're driven to drugs, they're driven to crime, and so on. And of course, in America, you have that. You have this vast army, as I said, 10, 12 million people who are in that position. And so that's why you have this rampant crime, gun violence, and all the rest of it. I mean, this has social effects. And of course, these people just do not care, actually. I mean, to say they're Christian is a total travesty, as I said. And I'll say it quite loud. They never read what Jesus said.
Actually, that's my next question here.
Right.
Is, John, after you receive benefits, you receive the education, in fact, you did go to work.
I did.
Okay, now, you speak of the army of unemployed as if this is some block instead of being something that people process through.
Well, actually, that's not quite true. So it's because in England, for example, once Thatcher got done, what happened was that the miracle that happened in England was the discovery of North Sea oil, completely unforeseen. I mean, this is why I really should talk about what went wrong with England, but never mind.
Maybe next time.
Anyway, there was this vast pot of money available, and it should have gone into investing in Britain, okay? But it wasn't. So because she wiped out whole swathes of industry, shipbuilding, steel, and so on, these people went on the, in fact, what happened was they went on the sick. They weren't disabled, but the doctor would give them sick notes. And so they were all paid basically to be unemployed. And so even today, you've had generations and generations that are still unemployed. I mean, they are acculturated.
So, but your solution to that is what?
Actually, the solution to that is, as I've always said, is to have a business creation and a retraining program, okay, which the state pays for.
Well, Jesus had a plan for that in the parable of the vineyard, in which the worker who arrived last got the same pay as those who had worked all day. Now, I'm not quoting Jesus as an economist. Well, okay, I'm giving you. I mean, okay, you've gone after the Judeo-Christian civilization, culture.
Well,
and so I'm trying to probe you on this.
Okay.
And I'll go back to the Jewish tradition, since it seems we have blasted the Christians out of the water. So, one of the Jewish blessings blesses everything you put your hands to. One of the other understandings that the rabbis hold is that the proper understanding of the Sabbath is that you work 6 days and then you take the day off for the Lord. If you have not worked 6 days, you are not properly taking the Sabbath. So everything about the tradition has to do with actually hands-on working. And what you're saying is someone not working, who perhaps might even be capable of working, that in fact they should receive all the benefits that the laborer.
No, I've never said that, actually.
That seems to
No, I haven't.
evoke from what you're saying.
No, I have never said that, because that is not is not feasible to happen. No, in fact, look,
And see, during the
let-
30s, what lifted us out of depression? Wasn't it the work programs, the WPA and so forth? Those
Yes,
are all work
no,
programs.
actually,
It helped that the wars would really pull us.
yeah, they,
Right.
okay, yes, Calvin was right. It was a palliative. It was a palliative, but it was the war spending that really pulled the economy out of recession. I mean, massive spending, which is what Keynes proposed. So, but let me make another point. You mustn't confuse Christianity with the Old Testament.
Whoa.
All right?
That's a whole other topic.
Yeah,
Yes.
they buy both testaments.
Well, look, what I would say is, my own view, having read both, there's no connection between the two. Now, of course, the religious would say, well, there is a connection because Jesus was the Son of God and all that stuff.
I think Jesus would have an argument with you on that.
Well, look, I would not accept that at all. I think that was, a fiction created by the latter religions, actually. And I think, as I've said before, religion is one thing, Christianity and its views are totally another thing. And I think, as I said, look, the Old Testament is the history of the Jews and its culture. In fact, if you read it, all the doctrines, and you read the New Testament, they're totally different. I mean, it's a whole different culture. Yeah, it is. Anyway, carry on. Lorraine?
Don't you find that a lot of irony in the fact that people call a lot of or refer to the Democratic platform policies or desired policies as being socialist and, which in most Americans' mind means you're in the back door of communism and so on and so forth.
Yeah, right. That's right.
But then at the same time, you have the irony that these very same people don't seem to understand that Medicare and Social Security are all the very same kind of societal entitlements, okay? And they don't seem to have a problem with the fact that all these religious charities, they take in all this money, and they go out and they feed the homeless and all that, but they somehow don't seem to understand that that is really also the responsibility of government to ensure that citizens shouldn't be homeless, to provide an economy and certain standards, that people aren't lying in the gutter and dying. Because how many elderly people would have died before Medicare came into play? And many people, by the way, in the 70s, and more so in the 80s, I know that there were elderly people that were so poor that they were resorting to eating dog food and the like, and their prescriptions, because their prescriptions started to go up and up and up, okay? And I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think it's Christian, if you want to use that descriptor, as somehow being a decent person that understands and is giving. I don't think that as well, that they sit back and just sort of flip that stuff off to one side until maybe it hits them,
Well,
It's
as I said, as I mentioned, the get out is the evangelicals take is that these people are the undeserving poor that have only themselves to blame, you see, for their predicament, and therefore they need a big kick up the backside to get back to work and be productive. I mean, that's their thinking. And therefore any social programs are a waste of money because these people are worthless and
but don't take Social Security or Medicare away.
Yeah. Well, you see, I think the problem is, the well-nourished and well-fed and the bourgeoisie, so to speak, can never ever put themselves in the place of the down and out and so on. And so they develop this callous attitude to them and denigrate them. And this is what you saw, and this is what David Cameron did. I mean, basically, they gave, after 2010, they came in, they cut taxes on the top echelon, and then they began to slash the budgets for the poorest, until the House of Lords actually called them out of it and said, look, you know, don't do this. It actually shamed them to repeal. So you see, the Parliament today is legislative, and the House of Lords has a review. And because the House of Lords really are not totally hereditary anymore, but mostly they're appointed, they act as the conscience of the nation. And that's what we lack in this country. We don't, the Senate is not the conscience of the nation, while, especially with the chinless wonder we have leading it, certainly not.
Well, I'm still probing you on this issue of benefits. I think we don't have Albert here this evening, so we can't perhaps get the full ambiance of the Libya situation. But prior to the Arab Spring attacks on Libya, they seemed to have a pretty ideal system there. They had a benevolent dictator. They had all kinds of benefits to the people. Now, what is different about what they had there in Libya as opposed to what we have here? And I can tell you it's the dollars. I'm going back to the 1998 reporting. We were taking in $483 billion in tariff money, imposts, excise, and tariffs. And that all stopped. It went to zero when NAFTA and GATT kicked off in 1999. During that same reporting year, because that's the only one I have the figures on, the IRS took in $510 billion in individual income taxes. Now, what I understand is the money that went to the IRS actually went out through the Federal Reserve to God knows where. But some people claim
to go to the Treasury, but you know.
In fact, it never paid a single program here in the United States. It just paid off money on the debt or the loan or whatever that the Federal Reserve is doing. So what we have is we've got two incredible drags on the finances. If you just take $1998 and multiply it forward to today, that's $10,143,000,000 in 1998 money that we never made up for, and that became a part of our national debt, because there really was no replacement for the tariffs. So what I'm saying is, you're talking about doing benefits. I'm not saying it's not possible to do benefits, but don't we first need to get the financial house in order and get the balanced trade we need before we're outlaying all these programs?
Well, my you know, every time I get up here, actually, I talk about business creation. I mean, I want to see the unemployment level driven down to 1%. Okay, you know, there's no need for it to be up at 3 or 4%, 5%. And of course, after the Great Recession, the unemployment went up to about 11%, 11, 12%. So yes, of course, you must have systems that help. Well, one, you must have a business creation system that creates business, which is, I would say, employee-owned. You must have a system that funds it, okay? And of course, then your tax base, you know, is immediately improved by, in fact, so the tax base, if you say there's about 160 million people working, if you add another say 10 million to that, you know, that would really cover the benefit you're going to pay to the people who still churn in the system, because you will always have the poor, the poorest.
And Jesus said that.
Right, so they will always be with us. Okay. Now, but as I say, I lived in a system that 1% unemployment. Almost everyone was employed. I mean, you never saw people who didn't go to work. And of course, due to this crazy ass system, you have this precarious system in England, 0-hour contracts and the gig economy. Look, if you can't pay if you run a business, you can't pay a decent wage, really, you shouldn't be in business. As simple as that.
I think we're out of questions.
You got a question?
You get to sit down.
All right.
Now it's your turn. I've been silent too long. Now it's your turn to talk, so who wants to speak first?
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to hear somebody from the other side express their opinions in depth. I like that. However, I cannot reconcile Christianity with Democrat policies. There's a whole lot of policies the Democrats have that do not comport with what the Bible says. And using the government as a way of, I don't know which would do it, giving money to the poor, which supposedly is a great thing to do. All you have to do is look at the cities that have been run by Democrats for decades, like San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, New York, and the list goes on. There's a whole bunch of them. And those are the cities where you have human feces all over the streets, you have needles all over the place. The EPA is even getting on to San Francisco now, telling them they need to clean things up because it's becoming a federal problem. And the crime is the worst. I mean, where the gun laws are the strictest, the shootings are the highest, and all kinds of stuff like that. So all you have to do is look at the examples of where Democrats have been running things for decades, and you see the results of the policies they pursue. It's not pretty. And since Trump has been in the White House, we have the lowest unemployment ever for all groups.
That's not true.
Well, you're not going to get it lower than what Trump has got. There may be one or two numbers out of all the unemployment numbers that aren't the lowest, but most of them are. The unemployment for blacks is the lowest, historically lowest, and I think for Asians and women and and all these groups. But anyway, and Trump gets thousands, tens of thousands of people coming out to his rallies, and I have yet to see a Democrat with thousands coming to a rally. There's maybe a few hundred. So it's obvious where the people of this nation stand. They agree with Trump. And Trump is actually doing the things that are helping people and getting jobs in here. And he's telling companies, got to move out of China and move back to the United States and build things here in the United States. Our speaker talked about jobs being shipped overseas, and here Trump is actually telling companies to move out of China and move back to the U.S. and build things in the U.S. If you don't want a tariff, move to the U.S. and build what you're building in the U.S. Seems to me that that's helping Americans. But anyway, I cannot equate Democrat policies with Christianity. It just doesn't fit.
First off, I don't think we have the boomiest economy going by any stretch. Secondly, I don't trust jobs added and unemployment figures and so on and so forth anyhow, because unlike years and years ago, if you talked about a job, you were talking 40 hours a week, not 20 hours. And even in this country, John, based on what you were talking, and I don't know if it's still going on in New York, but I know that a few years back, they had like a floating schedule, and you didn't find out until Sunday night what hours you were going to work for many companies. And if it was something that required you to move around, you had no idea how to plan babysitting or what have you. So this country is nowhere near what it used to be when I moved here in the 70s, okay? It has gone major backwards on so many levels. But the most disgusting thing is that how uncivilized people are to each other. I mean, there was issues with civilities in the 70s as well, but most of them, white privilege, I didn't get or feel any of that. But blacks, I think they would have a totally different narrative to speak, as they are beginning to have to do again today, because you've got these pious, in all likelihood Christians, telling them where they can plant a kid on a sidewalk, if they want to take a picture, or calling the police for this or for that. It's truly obnoxious, okay? Teaching their kids to tell those spics to get back to where they came from. This is not what I would want to hang on as my moral fiber. So if that's where Christianity's going, no thanks. And I've been indoctrinated by Christianity in my youth. So I do know what I'm talking about, and we just didn't go around treating people like this when I decided that I wanted to be religious and all that. Have no more time for it anymore, because the hypocrisy is horrendous, okay? And Donald Trump, who I really don't think has a religious feeling of any sort in his body, but whatever economy is here, he came on the tailcoats of Obama, he's the one that formed the miracles, bringing us down from the abyss. Okay, so I don't give him any credit for that, no. I think that the other things he's done is worse, and you talk about debt. They just added, what, 4 trillion, 2.5 trillion, 3 trillion, what have you? Give me a break, okay? And they don't seem to be jumping up and down and saying, oh, we can't have all this debt, okay? Because the Republicans have taken care of all their benefactors that have bought them for years. So don't talk about the Constitution when these people have absolutely destroyed whatever modicum of good thoughts for the development of a nation. They have taken it and twisted it, defied it, whatever laws, okay, that were there to protect everybody, freedom and happiness and liberty for all. It ain't in play, okay? It just isn't, and it's disgusting. You're talking also 500,000 homeless, and he goes to LA or San Francisco and he says, oh gee, San Francisco needs to clean up this homeless situation. It's not good for the prestige, okay, of the, city. But maybe he could take all those benefits he wrote in for golf clubs ownership in the new tax bill and give back some of the $88K that he saved just on his New Jersey property alone, because he threw a couple of goats on there, and now he gets a farming allowance, okay? And you talk about he's bringing back companies or insisting that companies come back. When is Trump Enterprises come back? Tell me, are any of the MAGA items made in America now? They're still coming in from China. And is Ivanka thrown away the multiple trademarks with the 600 or something hideous like that? Okay? when he first started to talk to China? She'd given up those trademarks? She's bringing back her goods here? I don't think so. And don't hold your breath, it'll never happen. And hopefully we won't have to hold our breath any much longer, because the guy will have to resign, one can only hope. But if he does, okay, no pardons by Pence, please.
Well, as usual, we have a controversy of facts. And I would point out, as far as welfare is, I have family members who believe that there's this entity called Uncle Sam that just has money and wealth pouring out of his pockets, and that Uncle Sam is going to take care, and Uncle Sam has got all this nurture that can be provided to them and so forth. And I think the idea is completely ridiculous that government is the solution to situations like this. Culturally, if you go back a few years, a century, what was the first line of defense? It was family. In our present culture, family has pretty much been destroyed. The next line of defense were the churches. Third line of defense would be community. And then on down the way, perhaps there might be some government program. But I know when I've been in a pinch before and I've gone to folks for help, the first thing anyone wants to know is, have you asked your family members? Of course, my family members are like, you're asking us? But we got that taken care of, resolved. But what I'm trying to point out is that this is a ridiculous attitude to take. Life is all about competition. From the plant kingdom on up, everything strives to survive. Even tree limbs work against each other to capture the light. And yet, we're supposed to be broke back, on our back, in need, receiving government benefits. If we can raise a finger to help ourselves, I think it's a responsibility for people to do. And I'm speaking to myself here too. And yes, there are some people who really can't manage at all, but I have friends who are disabled. One in particular is almost completely blind. He actually did work as a Braille specialist for the Library of Congress for a while. He has an exceptional mind. He's always studying, always listening to things. And he's always working to try to improve his position. So a disability, it can really put somebody down. Health problems, absolutely. But another illusion that you're working in here, maybe you don't realize you're doing it. My great-grandfather on my father's side was a doctor, and he was a doctor in Kentucky. And after the Depression years, they were still basically in the Depression, and he was dying. And his family member of 10 children started going through his office, and they found all these unpaid receipts from his patients. And he would do things. He'd like take a box of tomatoes in payment, or he'd do anything people could do, because it was his work as a doctor to serve the community. Well, he actually got up off of his deathbed, walked 1.5 miles to his office, took all those receipts, put them in a trash can, and burned them, walked 1.5 miles home, laid down, and died. because he did not want his customers to be, his patients to be oppressed by his family. Now, that is, the medical profession has come a long way, and the way has been paved by government programs. Prices have gone up on everything because of government programs, because of government subsidies. So the most simple procedure, the simplest office visit, with all these different insurance plans, Medicare, Medicaid, you name it, now there are these huge financial transactions. It's completely skewed the market. People cannot get sensible priced health care these days. I know I had a dentist friend who was actually put in jail for, he was jailed, I think for about 7 years. It was a long time. Because he would not charge his patients the going rate that dentists are supposed to charge, what is the industry standard. And he was treating a lot of Hispanic patients and other patients who really didn't have the money. And as his skill in his profession, he was doing that out of the goodness of his heart. First they pulled his license, and then they had him on probation, and you know, he continued to do what he considered was his profession. They ended up locking him up. So, you know, this to me is, this is the result when you start trying to make government something it is not. Government should not be the first resort. It really shouldn't be. And I'm sure there are government programs that help. And the best thing about a government program is for it to do its job, and as Charlie Smith used to say, just let it sunset itself out.
Lorraine? Oh, I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to say something quickly to that, but that's all right. I'll wait for that. I didn't see Calvin.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, look, on the back of this t-shirt, there's a saying from Benjamin Franklin. Okay, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And that was said by Benjamin Franklin, okay? And like I said, it is just, the other thing as it relates to religion, people don't seem to have any problem whatsoever in giving 10% of their earnings, paying their tithes, so that, you know, the so-called charity can go on and do good works, most of which is printing Bibles and proselytizing further. But I know they have programs, okay, and nor do I agree that the federal government should be giving them any money to put those programs forward either. However, they don't even blink an eyelid at that. Yet they have these pastors that give them warm fuzzies on Sundays, and then they take off in their $2,000 suits, jump on their plane, and, you know, go to this holiday home or that holiday home, and this is all on the taxpayer's dime. So I don't understand what your sense of outrage is when it comes to those things. Sorry.
No problem, no problem. I'm a patient man.
Yeah.
John, Georgia presentation. And, I just wanted to kind of react to some of the observations that made here this evening. This employment thing, when President Obama's term in, it was 4.9%. When he started, it was 10%.
That's right.
And actually, it's nothing that President Trump has done that has increased employment. He hasn't passed no law. The tax law was, for most people, was nothing. And, but we can each see the same thing and see it differently. And that's what I see you see. We see the same thing. When you talk about what happened years ago when doctors used to do, my family doctor in the country, my parents were, he would drive his car out to your home and see you. And I was ill at an early age, and he and I were friends until he died. And we gave me a tie for graduation. I complained about racism, and he said it was going to change, it was going to be better. But that was then. Healthcare is high. I had a tough year with colon problem in 2016. I was at Charlton Methodist for 4 days, and that was $50,000 just for the hospital. And every doctor that said hello submitted to me. And then what they just basically did, diagnosed and said what was wrong, and then later on I had to go back and get those things done. So one was a day surgery, so I was in and out a day. The next one, I was in the hospital 13 days. And that hospital bill was $100,000 just by itself. And every doctor did the same thing. So I would say there are things that cause healthcare to be high, but we want quality care. We want people well trained to do it. That costs money. And some hospitals make a lot of money, they say private nonprofit, but they are really not. But when you talk about a low premium policy, which is health care, you don't have no coverage. It's a high deductible and a copay, and most people don't get that far. The insurance company don't pay nothing because it's the way it's set up. I know there's some things that could be done. I don't see the government as being the problem all the time. That's why we have government. And if you talk about way back before, during the last Depression, the church didn't have enough money to do nothing. The government had to get involved, but people would have died. In the church today, they have more money, but they spend it different ways. And they just do the programs they want to do, and they can, that's their prerogative. But that's not taking care of the masses of people that need help. On the religious thing, it's we have more churches in the United States. We have more people go to church in the United States than anywhere else in the world. But when you look at outcomes of how people look how we demonize each other, that's not Christian. And the greatest demonizer in history that I know about is in the White House. And then one of the religious guys, the largest Baptist church here in Dallas, Reverend Jeffers, he is not a Christian based on his iteration. But the church does. They do a lot of little things for people that they want to give to. And that's why the church can't do it. I agree the family is in trouble. But we have to look at this thing. America has not been a fair nation to all people. And it still is not. And you talk about, I don't know no blacks who was unemployed that's working since President Trump was president. So I'm pretty much in the community and I see them. You have a large number of people working part-time, and they kind of and that's a large number of people. They have no benefits. And you have people that's giving up. If we're going to do anything for people unemployed, they have to be retrained for the jobs that exist. And President Obama presented that 2 or 3 times in the Republican work funding. And he was looking at the people. And I want to give you an example. It's true. Someone I think, gentleman made it earlier that when people are unemployed, in 2016, an article came out, it's good research. And it's the highest demographic group of people were dying, committing suicides, were white men, 25, 45. These were men who had jobs all their life, worked in heavy manufacturing industry, unionized, and their job was outsourced. The factory was closed. They were taught a skill. They came out of high school, went in those companies. They taught them a skill. I have two brothers that did that, and then once all the jobs was outsourced, the factory was closed. They were nowhere to get a job. They could only get a minimum wage job, and they lost everything. They lost their self-respect. And I have a great deal of compassion, empathy for them, because they really didn't understand what had happened to them and why. And they got on drugs. They committed suicide, and it was a terrible problem. And it's true, you said. Barry Sanders talked about that, Senator Sanders, and Mr. Trump talked about that, bringing jobs back. What people forget, President Obama had the CEO of General Electric was working. They were bringing jobs back, but they were not labor intensive. You had to be trained. They were robotics and digital, and that's the only job that's coming back. And we don't have those kind of jobs. We will not be competitive in the world. You're not going to get those simple lines right. They're gone forever. They're never coming back.
Me?
And so that's a reality. And yeah, President Trump said in some company in Illinois, Ohio, that they was getting ready to send the jobs to Brazil, and they didn't agree to send them, but they cut them in half. But and then they gave them money to retool, and then after about a year, the remainder of them lost their job because they didn't have training. So I think what we got to do, and the other thing is racism and genderism and all those kinds of things has created a problem, and it's going to take a lot of effort to fix it. People have been in welfare 2 generations. They think differently from other people, and you know they don't have the training to get a job, and if they had it, they don't have the discipline to do it. But you know, religious people and people, we're too well to the nation for those kind of conditions to exist. We need to fix that and recognize that we made an error, and let's fix it. But all these iterations we made right here, the government do that. The government gets involved when the states and local governments don't. And a lot of the problems, like infrastructure, they don't have the money to do it. The federal government's got to be involved. And we haven't passed an infrastructure bill. And we still say we don't need affordable health care. So I think we need to think a little bit about it. And retraining is what has to be done. Religious are to live up to what they profess, practice what they profess. They're not doing it in the act. So that's the way I see it. Thank you.
Well, I wanted Ken to get up, but he didn't go into what I was thinking he was going to go into the first time through. But while John was talking, he did an internet search on world giving. And the first country per capita giving was Myanmar
For the last couple of years.
for the last couple of years.
The U.S. was first before that.
The second in there was the United States.
Well, I've shown that Indonesia, Australia, UK, but Myanmar is up
Okay.
there.
Yeah, the U.S. was first or second for the past like 4 or 5 years.
Okay,
No,
past 4 or
I
5
didn't
years.
say
So
that.
what I'm saying is we not only have a controversy, but we have a controversy of facts. That's what I'd like to bring up.
The only controversy, John, was that it's not just Christians that somehow make charity happen. Okay. Non-religious people make it
I
happen.
think I'm the last one standing. I want to thank our speaker. I thought he did a great job here tonight. My mother used to say that she was a product of the Depression, And she said, you can buy a lot for $1, but nobody had $1. They're all out of work. And so they got used to it. And when everybody's out of work, then that's what happens. Now, one of the things that was brought up earlier was that, you know, WPA projects, different programs help get out of depression. But then what really did it was they shortened the workday in this country from 10 hours to 8 hours. And from the work week from 60 hours to 40 hours. It was in 1938. And that had to happen. That was Francis Bacon, who was the Secretary of Labor at the time. And she passed that on to Roosevelt, the 8-hour day. And that's how they put it in play. And it had to be put in there because all the WPA project and everything else was fizzling out. It wasn't, it reached a stagnant point. They couldn't spend any more money. They had to figure out what to do. So they shortened the workday. And this reinvigorated our economy, put people back to work. And it put, in fact, it put women in the workforce. That's how women got in the workforce. And then during World War, it put us through World War II and successfully. And no other country did this. And we passed it on to other countries. They went to an 8-hour day. We were the first ones that did it. So that's something to think about. Today we have a Congress. I've said, John mentioned here, we have the best Congress money can buy. And that is really one of our biggest problems. And money talks, and these people are doing what the money directs. And the money is by the corporations and by big entities. And so we have a president that's bowing to that. That's not a good thing. We have in my view, one of the things that could change this would be the last 90 days of a general election would be free airtime. And I think Congress would vote for that because they get to keep the money they raise. And there's no history of a challenger being an incumbent in a general election. It doesn't happen, not in this century anyway. And so once they put it in place, then some challengers would get free airtime also, and they would beat some incumbents. And then everything would change. They would end up representing the people that did the electing instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington, which is what you wanted in the first place. It make things more democratic. And then you could put tariffs on corporations. For example, the auto industry today left Lordstown, Ohio, and went to Mexico. And there's no tariff on them. They didn't tariff them. They tariffed China, the imports that had nothing to do with our productions. We need to put tariffs on our American corporations that leave town and go overseas on us. They were arguing about, who was it, the motorcycle company, Harley Davidson. They didn't want them to go to Europe. Well, I don't care if they go to Europe. They go to Europe, but as soon as they send one motorcycle back here and try to sell it here, it's produced in Europe, then I put a tariff on it. I mean, that's where it belongs. And if they want to expand to another country, fine, they can do that. But that doesn't bother me. But it's when they try to produce something in another country and sell it back here, that's when they should pay a huge tariff. Because otherwise, production, everything else is followed by jobs. The jobs follow production. And your scientific investment, everything else, it goes with the production, and you end up losing. And you say we are our own problem. We create a lot of this, and we've got corporations leaving town on us. Now, today, if you look at our society today, we have. It was brought up here earlier about the cities were doing so badly. And we got young people not doing so well, and they're not being watched. Because why? Everybody's working long hours. And why are they working long hours? I can remember in the railroad industry, it was cheaper to work 2 people 12 hours a day and pay them time and a half after 8 than it was to work 3 people 8 hours a day because the high cost of fringe benefits. So the net result, you had 2 people overworked, overtaxed, pay for a third person to sit home with their feet up, and nobody's happy. So down the road, in my view, I'm in favor of a shorter workday. I'd say, I think this country should go to a 6-hour day instead of an 8-hour day, and not cut the pay. Get the same take-home pay in 6 hours and made an 8. That's how we got the 8-hour day down from 10. And then you'd have more people working, paying taxes. You'd have less people not working, draining taxes. The government get a twofold benefit of increased tax revenue, not raising taxes, If less bills to pay for people aren't working, say be working. You wouldn't gain 2 hours leisure time. You already lost it in traffic. You get it back. And you'd have more time to watch your kids when you're not there because you are there. You'd have a better society. And you take care of things. That's what we need. And that's the direction we should move in my view. But I better shut up while I'm ahead and give this back to John.
Called being civilized. Called being civilized.
Well, I'm glad everyone was in agreement tonight. It warms my heart. Yes, well, what I would say, because as I explained, I was helped by, without government programs after the war, my family were wiped out actually financially before the war. I mean, they were basically the petit bourgeois, I believe. So they had some wealth, but not. Anyway, but it didn't survive the war. So really, I owe what I am to that system. It is effective. It does work. I'm proof of it. Okay. Now, the fact that the reason I talk about religion and Christianity is because it plays such a big role in this country. See, in England it doesn't. Really, it just doesn't. People go to church, that's okay, but they don't wear it on their cuffs all the time, and they don't parade around it as a vote getter. I mean, and they don't behave as they preach. I mean, they basically operate as total hypocrites, in my judgment. And that's really why I often talk about it. Because really, you have to, we talk about the facts and so on and so forth. Look, the fact is, these people spout one thing and do something totally different. Now, so we have what's called socio-economic problems. Like the society really is a reflection of the economics applied in the country. But if you only apply it to if you have the top elite, the tail wagging a dog, you do not get an optimum outcome in an economy. You can't. Because really, when you think about it, the wealth of the whole country is not created, certainly not created, by these top executives. I mean, for example, Thomas Cook, the travel agency in England, went bust. And the CEO walked away, and this was happening over a period of years. And the CEO walked away with £8 million last year. Now, do I think he was worth that? And the company went down the drain?
Not if the company goes down the drain.
Well, even if they succeed, because look, the wealth of the country is dependent on the work of the whole collective body of the corporate mass. Actually, when I say the corporate mass, I mean the ordinary people. They're the ones that you can look to work hard, be motivated, and create wealth. They're the ones that do it. It's not these executives at the top. That's why these are the people that you count upon. These are the people you must invest in. I don't want a system whereby we have this funny money casino where the money is trapped in Wall Street, is really just gambled on pushing up the price of assets because it's sort of funny money. It's not real money. And so, yes, I think, you see, what we're talking about is proper regulation. So government is an enabler. Yes, of course. We need individuality. We need to nurture it. But you won't nurture it when people don't have the money to go to college, have the money to take after school classes and so on. And so, many people don't even go to college because they can't afford it. And in England now, it's it's gone out of sight. People say, look, I'll be, and as you know, in England and in here, this massive amount of money is like a weight round their neck forever. And it's certainly in England, houses have gone up so much, no ordinary person can afford to buy a house anymore. And that really is because we've had this massive price inflation of housing assets, and it's still the same house, is what I'm talking about. So it's money not being spent properly. And really what this means is government regulation, actually, to prevent this. And as I said about financial regulation, look what's happened. I mean, the City of London, God, used to be, my word is my bond. They were honest in those days. Now basically, you have financial spithery, and they'll cheat you, as soon as you look at it. So really, they're ripping off the whole world. And you've got the financial system being 20% of the economy. It's absurd to be that large. Now let's look at the National Health Service. Per capita, it spends half of what America spends. Half. And everyone's covered. Because there's, this privatized split system where you go to the doctor's office, and there's what? 3 or 4 people managing all the paperwork. Because they're all trying to figure out, what insurance company do you have? Do they cover this? Will they cover that? And the doctor says, well, I want to prescribe this. Will it be covered? No, it won't. I'd like to give you a date scan, for example. No, you can't. Okay? And so we're spending 18% of the GDP on healthcare. In England, the equivalent would be about half that. Now, this is the wonder of this so-called private enterprise system. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is, the government runs the social security system really on a shoestring, actually. It's very cost effective. Governments can do this, actually. And private enterprise, you see, it's called the economies of scale. All right? Now, when you have these multiple different entities in the healthcare system, it's very inefficient. So there are some things, like education, healthcare, housing, I think can be under the auspices of the state or government because it's very cost effective. And those are the things like healthcare and education, I think, that are really the drivers of the economy. And if they're not effective, you don't have a functioning, growing economy. It's just common sense, I think. Now, I brought in Christianity and so on because I think it's the attitude to the poorest in this country that I find so abhorrent. I mean, these guys that run these corporations just don't care about their workforce. I mean, basically, they think by paying them the least, that's good business. Well, as Walter Reuther was walking around a Ford factory, and I think it was Henry Ford II said, "Hey, look at all these robots we've got working here." And Walter Reuther said, "Well, do robots buy cars?" So what that meant was, you must pay people enough to buy the goods. Okay? The notion that you can, pay people less and less and make more profit is ludicrous. Because what you're doing is cutting demand. So you must pay people enough. And when you do aim for a 1% unemployment, you get more taxes, more people are in work, the social conditions are better, people that work have more self-respect and confidence. And when you work a system where you have a business creation system that actually attracts people into work, okay, and creates new businesses and will train people, then I think you'll have a growing proper economy. And that's what I would advocate, where people have a democratic say in their lives and so on. So it should be employee owned. And I will still maintain that. This notion that the guys at the top know everything and should be paid these enormous salaries, to me is ludicrous. They're only as good as the people at the bottom of the company, actually. And if you have underpaid people at the bottom without benefits, you don't have a good company in the long run, because you'll just attract the worst. So the whole notion is backwards. The way we think about each other and so on, I think is backwards. I think when you treat people with respect and you give them as much a helping hand as you can, then things work a lot better. That's it.
Very good.
See you next week.
Thank you, John.
Oh,
Well, that's it for tonight.
I'm sorry, thank you for the,
That's it for tonight. Our speaker, see y'all next week. Our speakers here, they kick us out here at 10 o'clock, so just so you know.